this guy's career took him to Stanford Law School. And as I say, the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics is where he did a fellowship, and so much of his work goes back to that place. So his new book is particularly intriguing. From Oversight to Overkill, Inside the Broken System That Blocks Medical Breakthroughs and How We Can Fix It. How about it for Dr. Simon Whitney? Doctor, hello, sir.
Hello, Mark. Good to be with you.
It is so intriguing. I think especially since we've all become these, maybe not armchair doctors, but desperate for medical information with COVID hitting. And we're scrambling for different sources, maybe the best way to put it, you know, everything from YouTube platform shows to blogs to our own personal doctors. We're just trying to learn all we could about, you know, what COVID was and what these various coronaviruses were and what that vaccine was. You know, there was the Johnson & Johnson, there was the, you know, all of these different ones. So I guess I mentioned that in the ramp up to our conversation to say, wow, I mean, you've met your moment, because when it comes to questions about medical ethics and what's appropriate for the general public, it seems as that this is that moment in time.
I sure hope so. And it's funny you mentioned these problems because during the pandemic, we saw the collision of both the first major pandemic in our time and of a pandemic of medical misinformation, disinformation. Those two things together killed hundreds of thousands more people than would have died otherwise.
The mRNA vaccine was this technology that, as I was reading, was really something that was being prepared or being researched in relation to things like cancer. And it was repurposed in this way during the time of great need to sort of stop the bleeding with the COVID numbers.
That's right. It was on the rack with no obvious immediate use until, boom, COVID came into view and there was an immediate use. And to have a vaccine so soon after COVID appeared, that was very close to miraculous. The reason we got that vaccine so rapidly was because of Operation Warp Speed, which swept aside all the usual barriers to drug development and just shoot it through those gates quite rapidly. So my question, one of the questions in my book is, why is it that we don't have Operation Warp Speed for heart disease or cancer or Alzheimer's? These instead proceed at horse and buggy speed, and the delay is costing lives.
It's so interesting that you mentioned this, because I got an email just last week about Alzheimer's. I think we're going to have her on tomorrow. There's a big protest about, it's in San Francisco, about Alzheimer's drugs being kept off the market, even though they do show some promise. This is from, and you know, the crippling nature of Alzheimer's for families and for the victims of Alzheimer's themselves. In a sense, entire families are victims. I wonder about that. I mean, so give me an example of what's happening. Is it the institutions of government? Is it, why aren't those things being rushed through? And how promising are these medications?
Well, the problem with the current Alzheimer's drug, the new one that was recently approved, was that it helps a little, sometimes, in some people, for a lot of money. We need better drugs than that. It's that simple. Or better prevention methods, even better. The thing that's slowing these down is complicated, and there are many parts. My focus is on one particular part that nobody has ever heard of, the IRB system, as you said in your intro. And IRB, there are IRBs, these committees that oversee research and will give the green light to only ones they feel are appropriate. There are IRBs at every institution that does research across the country, and they are supervised by a federal agency that nobody's ever heard of. The FDA, which supervises drug and device development, has thousands of employees and a budget in the billions. The OHRP, the little agency that supervises this particular branch of medical research, has, I think, 26 employees and a budget in the millions. So they're They're barely on the radar, but they slow an important part of America's medical research efforts, and they do so in a way that we should all be appalled by.
So I'm going to follow up on that in a moment. I just want to mention regular viewers and listeners to the show know that we rotisseried that Alzheimer's drug that you're talking about. It was laid bare how little in the way of advancement it actually provided and how expensive it was, just to the point you were making. By the way, on that stuff, anything with a cognitive diminution of any sort is so difficult to characterize in research, because a lot of it is, the analysis and results of this research are so interpreted, that is to say, like, who can tell whether I'm doing a little bit better based on various testing, right? So right away with something like Alzheimer's, and as I say, anything involving cognitive challenges, I think the research alone can be flawed from the very start.
Well, it's difficult to do good research on something as subtle as cognitive decline. When I was in practice, I would regularly see men in their 40s or 50s who would say, "Doc, my memory's failing." I would say, "You poor thing, what's wrong?" And they would say, "When I was in college, I didn't have to crack a book. I could listen to a lecture, know everything, and just write it down in the exam. And then, I could look at a book, I remember what page it was on. Now I have to read the darn thing to remember." I would say, "Get out of here and don't forget the copay," because their cognition had not declined to a point that I felt sorry for them.
All right, so let me go back now then and do the follow-up on what you were just saying about this government agency and about the governmental process. So you were mentioning this smaller agency. This is a place where stuff gets jammed up. Is that your point?
Yes. The system was set up for a very good reason. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, in which hundreds of Black men in Alabama were followed closely by government doctors, but never given medication for the syphilis they knew they had. Of these men, many died. This was deliberate. I mean, they weren't given syphilis by the government. The government did nothing to treat them, even after penicillin became available. Okay, so this is the worst experiment ever conducted on American soil. In an attempt to make sure this never happened again, the government set up a system designed to protect research subjects. And that was its only goal. And when I present it that way, it sounds reasonable. But the problem is there's a balance to be made, as there is with almost every government intervention, between protecting research subjects and letting research happen. And if you protect research subjects not only against major risks like syphilis untreated, but against minor risks like bruising at the site of a blood draw, or pains or inconveniences that go away rapidly, and you don't let people even choose to undergo these risks for the sake of research, then research is slowed dramatically. You mentioned the Alzheimer's example. Well, millions of people are suffering with Alzheimer's, and many millions more are looking at their parents suffering with it, knowing it's genetic, and trembling in their boots. Will the IRB community let research in Alzheimer's proceed uninhibitedly? No, because there's a concern that you might not be mentally capable of giving your full consent to the new treatment that's being tested.
Wow.
This is a concern. It's not a crazy concern, but the result is that it thwarts people who, when they were still cognizant, would have been very happy to sign the consent form, and whose kids are very happy to say, "Sure, this new treatment seems like it's not that different from what else is available. We'll give it a try." No, this is all tangled up in a complicated web, and it's hard to get it done because we're trying so hard to protect subjects from harm, we've forgotten that all of us need better care.
I always feel as though if something doesn't make sense, like the length of time it takes to get a drug or some kind of improvement to market or to actually help people, that it's about money. How much of this problem that we're having, and I get it, you detail it in your book. I mean, these are myriad problems, right? From oversight to overkill. That institution of oversight is made up of all of these, as you've just suggested, these agencies and people we don't even know exist. How much of it, though, falls under the category of money?
That's a great question, because money is usually the explanation. It's the explanation for why medicine in general has gotten so profoundly screwed up nowadays, because somebody discovered that you could turn a patient into an ATM. And the moment somebody discovered that, we were all in deep trouble. So back to my system and the problems with it. Actually, here, I think it's an exception to your rule. I think that the problem here is fear. Fear of the federal hammer. Because if an IRB steps out of line in the smallest way, in retrospect, the federal hammer can still fall. And when it does, all research funding at that institution is held up until things are cleared up, which can cost millions of dollars a day. So that's why institutions are so very risk averse. And that's why an IRB made up of reasonable people may make ridiculous decisions and slow down research for no good reason at all.
How is the IRB and who comprises these various review institutions, how is that decided?
It's typically a dozen people or thereabouts. The number can vary. A medical school will have an IRB, or perhaps 2 or 3 if it does a lot of research. They're appointed by the vice dean for research to serve for as long as the institutional reviews provide. And these dozen or so people consider proposals for research, and they say, this one can go, this one we're going to prohibit, and this one needs to have a revised consent form that's more clear. At least that's the theory. What happens in practice is they look at each proposed research and say, what could possibly go wrong with this? Well, let's imagine something. I'll give you the example that I think is most illustrates the problem. We don't want people to be given syphilis or to have syphilis untreated. We don't want people to have Alzheimer's untreated if there is a treatment. But these are not the risks that IRBs usually worry about. Let's think about a guy doing a physiology experiment. The physiology is how the body works. You've seen those photos of an athlete on a treadmill with a nose clips and a tube leading oxygen down and something across his chest measuring exertion. That's how we understand better how the body responds to altitude, low pressure, hard work, all these various things. So one of the early manuals for how IRB should think said, look at experiments like this. You might think there is no risk there, but actually, it's actually more risky than you would imagine. Well, the athlete getting off the treadmill could stumble and get a black eye by hitting his eye against something. Well, that doesn't seem like such a big deal, but think about the black eye. The black eye could lead to him being turned down for a social opportunity, or he could be passed over for employment in favor of another candidate who interviewed without a black eye, or it could be legal. This could happen from participating in the experiment. The police could make a connection between his black eye and the neighbor who was the subject of a brutal assault that left her comatose. This is not the risks of participating in research. This is a fantasy world. And if it were in a sci-fi novel, I would think it was entertaining. But since it's helping guide these IRBs make their decisions, it harms us all.
You know, it's just so interesting as you draw it all out like that to think about the tremendous latitude. And I suppose this is the implication, and I can't wait to get into your book. The implication is the latitude and license you've given these IRBs, these review boards, these people to suppress information, to prevent its release, and to green light information. It's and you can suppress it in kind of the scenario that you just described, or you can have others. And it's interesting because I see the clamor over the suppression of information. Again, this goes back to this moment in time over the last 3 years where, you suppress the information about masks, you in the medical community, or Dr. Fauci, you suppress the information about how you have a monetary interest in these medications, in these drugs. About mRNA, the guy who created mRNA, you've suppressed the information about what he's saying. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., as you know, is coming forward with all these. Again, I don't mean to, it's not like all roads lead back to this, but this has just been our recent experience, which is why I feel that your book is so applicable to our recent experience. You're trying to balance, right, in the information against releasing things that could be harmful to the public and misinterpreted by the public?
It's always a question of balance. And if we had balance, we'd be better off. When we focus only on risk, it's like driving a car with 2 brakes and no gas pedal. You're not going to go very far.
The Oversight to Overkill. It's from Oversight to Overkill. The book is called Inside the Broken System That Blocks Medical Breakthroughs and How We Can Fix It. So, Doctor, you actually do address in this book the solutions to this broken system. In our last minute or so, can you just speak to how difficult that is? I feel as though we are in a country that is laboring through so many things that are both broken and getting broken. Also, it just seems as though some of these mountains are too tough to climb. How do you handicap some of the ways that you can fix this broken system that you identify?
Well, the broken system requires a change in federal law. You may have heard that politics is somewhat polarized now. I'm sure you have that. Okay. So this is one area in which, I've never met a Republican that didn't care about heart attacks. I've never met a Democrat that didn't care about cancer. So this is one area in which they can agree that if we had a common sense system, similar to the system we actually had 50 years ago, we can solve this problem and move on with our other issues.
I think lastly about this judge, and I'm not asking for your politics here at all. I don't know what your politics are. But when I see judges on the bench weighing in on the efficacy and safety of medications, it strikes me as something beyond the pale. I mean, these are people who have, I guess, great training in jurisprudence, but they don't have any training necessarily, certainly not the training required to evaluate the efficacy or safety of a medication. I feel as though our country's going the wrong direction, sort of agenda-driven on some of these medications.
In college, the people who are turned off by numbers are turned off by the idea of human feces, generally tend toward the law. People who don't not bother about these things go to medicine. And we have a system set up to approve drugs by medical experts in ways that they have worked on for years. And the judges could certainly step in if there's an egregious problem, but no such problem happened here.
Yeah. Dr. Simon Whitney, from Oversight to Overkill, Inside the Broken System That Blocks Medical Breakthroughs and How We Can Fix It. Really intriguing stuff. Looking forward to getting into it and loved our conversation. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Mark. My pleasure.
Dr. Simon Whitney, everybody. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.